September 10th, the airports in Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. Muscovites are fleeing the terminals. Explosions everywhere.
Indeed, in fact.
In 2 days, more than 2,000 flights in Russia have been cancelled or delayed, with losses amounting to $250 million. Drones are striking Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Novorossiysk.
Hands covered in blood.
Explosions, panic, hundreds of thousands of people unable to depart. For 4 days, they have been flying towards Moscow, turning life in the Kremlin and Moscow into hell. Ukraine has been attacking St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the regions with drones around the clock. The profound cost of chaos in Russia is now starkly measured in staggering billions of rubles, a sum that translates to well over 230 million US dollars, reflecting an immense economic burden. This devastating financial impact is largely attributable to a recent catastrophic aviation disaster that has gripped the nation. This disaster, in turn, is the direct and alarming consequence of large-scale, coordinated drone strikes that have targeted Moscow's vital territory, causing widespread disruption and fear. As a result of these unprecedented attacks, major airports across the region have been thrown into complete paralysis. Sheremetyevo, a key international hub, Pulkovo, serving the northern capital, and Nizhny, a significant regional airport, are all effectively shut down. The human toll is immediate and palpable, with countless people visibly crying, their distress evident, and many are forced to spend the night on the cold, hard floor of these now inoperable terminals, enduring immense discomfort and uncertainty. Strikes on aviation, the strategic base in Engels, the tactical one in Borisoglebsk, the fleet in Novorossiysk, as well as the Pacific Fleet, are all under attack. The Kerch Bridge is being attacked by 15 missiles. A tanker carrying ammonia in Ust-Luga has been blown up, but who is paying for all this?
What does this mean personally for the Russian market?
Let's find out now from my well-known economist and professor, Igor Lipsits. The damage from the carpet plan is estimated at more than 20 billion rubles, that's 236 million according to estimates. How do you assess the economic damage, and what does it mean for Russia?
Well, look, Russia is a rather complex country in terms of transportation. It's geographically long. There are so-called round countries where it's generally not very far to get from the center to any point. There are long countries, and Russia is one of them. For such a country, the transportation system is extremely important. And the problem now is that Russian civil aviation is in crisis, and passenger transportation is also not coping very well. Just recently, after the events of the last day or so at the airports, people rushed to the railways, trying at least to get to St. Petersburg by train. Tickets were instantly sold out. They're trying to urgently add extra carriages, but it's unclear how this will end. In general, transportation links are breaking down, and these losses for Russian civil aviation are already an unpleasant topic. Civil aviation in Russia, to put it mildly, is not a very profitable sector. It's more often unprofitable. The point is that Russian aviation was structured in such a way that it earned money primarily through various international connections. First of all, Aeroflot had a good income. Foreign companies paid it for flying through Russian airspace, transport routes to Asia and back passed through Russia, and Aeroflot received payment for the use of Russian airspace for transit flights. Now, this is practically gone. If you look at an air traffic map somewhere like Flight Radar, you'll see that there are far fewer planes in Russian airspace, and of course, that income has disappeared. Furthermore, Russian companies used to earn a lot by flying Russian tourists all over the world, but now Russian tourists have almost completely stopped traveling abroad. There's no need to mention that some people still go to Dubai or Egypt. These are nothing like the flows that existed before. Even the demand for foreign currency in Russia has sharply decreased precisely because outbound tourism has practically died. As a result, airlines can't fly people abroad anymore, and there used to be huge profits, especially in the summer, with a flood of charter flights that airlines made money on. Now that's gone. Domestic flights in Russia don't really pay off. They're unprofitable and have always been so. The Russian government subsidizes domestic flights so that Russians can move around the country, because if people can't travel within the country, then it's not really a country. There's no sense of unity if you can't get anywhere. But now, this is exactly the situation that's forming. No amount of money can solve the security problems at major Russian airports, which are now starting to go out of operation, leading to huge losses for Russian airlines. I repeat, they were already in a difficult position. What to do next is unclear. Of course, they'll ask the government for subsidies, and that would be fair because it's the government that got them into this mess. The government started the war, not the airlines. But now the airlines are suffering. But I'm afraid they won't get any money because now there's no money for anything except the war. We're already seeing this line of those in need. People go to the Ministry of Finance asking for money, and they're refused. For example, there's already been a case. The Russian coal industry is in a huge crisis, and to support it, they introduced lower tariffs for coal transportation, but then the losses fell on Russian railways, RZD. RZD went to the government saying, give us subsidies to cover the losses we're taking to keep the coal industry from dying quickly. They were told, that's not our problem, and no subsidies were given, and so on. So in this sense, it will be difficult to plug the hole in the airline sector's economy. That's why I think we'll see some very unpleasant stories related to the bankruptcies of Russian airlines and industry consolidation. Soon there may be only Aeroflot left in Russia, and the rest of the airlines probably won't survive. That's how I see the situation.
Nikolai Dmitrievich, regarding the lack of connectivity, non-functioning internet, YouTube, we've noticed that after the special operation, even Russian insiders report that not only in major cities, but across all of Russia, communication and internet are being jammed. This is being done as an attempt to counter special operations and Ukrainian intelligence services. How does this affect the everyday lives of ordinary Russians?
Well, this means that Russians are being completely cut off from global civilization. It might sound like a strange topic, but I have friends who recently went to Russia for a while to visit their parents, and they were horrified, saying, we've ended up in some kind of black zone. Nothing works, nothing is possible. We can't access the outside world. They try VPNs one after another, but none of them work. After the first connection, the second one is immediately detected and blocked. The VPN is diagnosed and stops working. So you end up in a soundproof room, unable to connect with the world in any way, unable to communicate with anyone, unable to work remotely. You're trapped inside Russia's information field. And this is, of course, a frightening situation. It has a significant impact. I've noticed it quite clearly. My YouTube views have dropped because many Russians simply can't watch. So I've started recording all my streams, making audio files, and created a special audio channel on Telegram so people can at least listen to my interviews, including yours, which will be available in audio format. Audio can still be listened to directly on Telegram, but watching is no longer possible. People are being cut off from gaming sites, as you've understood, from WhatsApp, from Telegram, and gradually from YouTube as well. In general, it's becoming a closed system. I'd say an informational concentration camp is being formed. Russians used to say that the war didn't affect them in any way, that it was happening somewhere on the periphery, that it was just a special military operation and had nothing to do with them. But now the war has reached them quite directly through cancelled flights and the disappearance of the ability to live in the information space. As the saying goes, you reap what you sow.
Dear audience, as I was just saying to Dmitry Vladimirovich, this is a question for you. We're interested in the geography of our viewers. Where are you watching us from? Please write in the comments where you're watching from, which city, which country, and whether you're using a VPN or not. Answer a few of these questions about your connection to Ukraine. How is your connectivity? Because we work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. That's why every like, every comment, and every subscription means you are on the side of light. And so, Dmitry Vladimirovich, regarding this important topic, the attacks on airfields, from an economic and military perspective, how much does it actually cost to restore infrastructure after the strikes in Engels, in Borisoglebsk, after strikes on key strategic military airfields like Putin'S? And how do such strikes on strategic aviation affect the military budget and Russia's ability to continue waging war for years to come?
Well, look, the situation is quite interesting. There was a recent report that Russia is trying to expand a plant for airfield production, but so far the Russian aviation industry has essentially lost this capability. How can I put it? Once upon a time, Russia was a great, powerful, and renowned aviation power. There were quite good designers, there were good combat aircraft, and we remember this situation. I remember from my childhood all these stories about significant dogfights in the skies over Korea, in Vietnam, where Soviet pilots disguised as Vietnamese fought against American pilots. Back then, it was a fairly even war, quite significant, and it seemed that Russian aviation would always be a very powerful industry. But then the decline began somewhere in the 1990s, and in general, the Russian aviation industry never recovered from that collapse. Now it has found itself in a kind of trouble because, as they say, they are just barely keeping things flying, squeezing the last resources out of old planes. Building new planes, including military aircraft, is difficult. Putting new machines into service is hard because the capabilities just aren't there. How can I put it? So much has been lost, and this isn't a process that's quick or obvious to people. When you talk about this process of degradation, people are surprised. What degradation? People are still working, right? But when the older generation starts to leave, it's crucial that a new generation of designers, engineers, technologists, and skilled workers comes in to take over production capabilities. That's when the industry survives. In Russia, this is a complete disaster because there are neither engineering nor working personnel. And this isn't just my opinion. Look, Chemezov, the head of Rostec, recently stated quite clearly that there is a huge shortage of personnel for the military industry in Russia. What will come of this? We don't know yet. For now, all this talk about reproducing and making new strategic bombers and so on is a very complicated story because the industry has to be capable of doing it, and there's no sense that it is. We see a simple picture. In civil aviation, nothing is working out. Russia can't launch new planes, and it desperately needs new aircraft. They started some projects like the MC-21, trying to make a new two-plane, some regional aircraft like the Baikal, but nothing is working. So much has been destroyed, so much lost, that it's extremely difficult to restore. Even the combat aircraft Russia had, like the Su series, are already starting to fall behind, simply because the electronics are outdated and they don't have their own modern electronics. So, of course, the losses are practically irrecoverable because Russia's industrial capabilities now simply don't allow for easy restoration. They can make the simplest types of weapons, like ammunition, and they've learned to make some simple drones, but something very complex. Apparently, it's no longer really possible to restore. And at this point, even money won't help. It's not about whether they have enough money to restore the fleet of strategic bombers. They can allocate the money, but they just can't actually do it anymore.
Igor Odin, regarding the fleet of so-called shadow tankers, we understand that there have been strikes on bases in Novorossiysk, in the Far East, and in St. Petersburg as well, targeting tankers. Economically, what is the scale of losses for the naval bases in Novorossiysk and the Far East? Is this an apocalypse for raw material exports and logistics chains?
Overall, the situation with maritime exports is becoming very complicated. I can't say it's a catastrophe yet, but things are getting bad. Several problems have emerged. The first problem is that European countries have finally decided to start inspecting Russian ships. I actually talked about this on the show, sometime around February or March of last year. I even wrote about it then, that basically there was a directive from the European Union, or maybe directive is too strong a word, but at least a recommendation from the EU to Denmark to enforce strict control over the passage of tankers carrying Russian oil through the Danish Strait. Well, at the time, the Danes were quite taken aback and didn't show any readiness to act. They said it would be very difficult for them to do, but in reality, it is quite possible to make it harder for these ships to pass through, if there was the will. As you can see, this scenario is now starting to play out. NATO ships are preparing to inspect these vessels carrying Russian oil to check whether they meet the requirements for this kind of navigation in the Baltic, whether they have insurance and so on. If they don't meet the insurance requirements, the ships will automatically be blacklisted, even without any special decisions from NATO, the EU, or the US. Then they will be subject to sanctions and face major problems. So there is now a threat that a large portion of the shadow fleet Russia has created will simply turn out to be unviable. We've already heard some numbers. It's hard to verify all this, of course, because you have to understand we're talking about things that aren't very obvious, quite secretive, and only some indirect estimates appear. I rely on those, and according to them, up to 400 ships are already on this blacklist and are being refused service. As a result, they are basically just sitting idle, anchored, if you will, not sailing. If this list expands, Russia will face even bigger problems. But still, if they manage to push it through, this idea of lowering the price cap to 45, which is included in the 18th package, then even greater difficulties will arise, and Russian maritime exports will fall even further. Combined with the low oil price, this is a very serious blow to Russia's financial situation, to the Russian budget, and to spending on Russian life. This, of course, is already a path leading to a truly extremely serious crisis situation in Russia's economy.
Igor Vladimirovich, you brought up a very important topic. Yes, this includes the shadow fleet, the 18th sanctions package, and the position of the US. As for lowering it to $30, that's not even being discussed at this point. But as for the shadow fleet, which Europe is still not fighting against, Chancellor Graham recently came out and said that Graham will be strengthening control over the shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea.
As you know, at the moment, only Slovakia and Hungary are blocking it, but the European Union in this regard is starting to learn something and is working out methods to bypass these obstacles. The blockades from Hungary and Slovakia, because they are always against it, they are practically a fifth column within the European Union. I don't understand how they can put up with this. But that's the EU's problem moving forward. Therefore, of course, there may be some solutions, and they might still manage to implement this price cap. And that would already be significant because, as they say, America is far away, but here, they're coming right around Europe. They leave from Ust-Luga and go around Europe. And accordingly, if not a single European port services them, they're going to have quite serious problems. And the US doesn't even benefit from this. You mentioned the word benefit. Yes, no, the US gains nothing from Russia exporting oil. But there are some idiotic concepts from Trump, like not quarreling with Putin so that at some point he'll come to his senses and eventually agree to end the war. That's a rather strange concept, but Trump had such dreams to resolve this conflict quickly and to get a Nobel Prize for it, which he still can't quite bring himself to give up on. He's even starting to grumble that Putin isn't living up to his expectations, but nevertheless, he still doesn't want to impose a sanctions regime against Russia. He hopes that Putin will eventually come to his senses and for his own benefit will back down. Of course, that's an illusion. That's not going to happen. But unfortunately, what you're saying means a very simple thing. By the way, the EU leadership has already voiced it. They said that we have to understand that the West, as we used to know it, no longer exists. In other words, this unified bloc of countries willing to somehow contain Russia's aggression no longer exists. There is the European Union as a separate entity. There is Europe as a whole, a collection of states, whether or not they are part of the EU. And there is the United States as a separate territory. This is the reality we are living in.
Ignatiy Vladimirovich, but still, let's model the situation. What if the European Union decides to vote for the 18th package of sanctions? How likely is that? How feasible will this be in practice, considering the shadow fleet and the position of the US? You are absolutely right to point out that from an economic standpoint, America's position is unclear. I also talk to economists, and they say that Trump's logic is hard to understand. This is purely a political decision.
Of course, but look, you have to understand that the price cap is still at 60 for Russian oil. But for now, you see, all the numbers I mentioned are very indirect. We live in a country that has classified all statistics, so it's very difficult. But still, apparently right now, Russian exports are going at a price of about 52, 53, which is below the cap. And that means Greek ships are transporting the oil. Greek ship owners are making money. They always try to help out and earn for themselves at the same time. They've profited from Russia more than once. They started out by transporting it. Oil in 2022, they made huge amounts of money extremely actively before the price cap was introduced. Then they sold their old tankers to Russia. And this whole, as I understand it, shadow fleet, these are former Greek tankers, but only the ones that were due to be decommissioned. Well, look, the point is that Russia's shadow fleet consists of old rust buckets. That's what they're called. Because you see, an oil tanker is supposed to be operated for 12 to 15 years. After that, it becomes dangerous rusts and all sorts of other bad things start happening to it. And usually they're sent off for scrap. But the Greeks managed to sell their old ships to Russia for quite large sums, in the billions. And now these shadow ships of the Russian fleet are tankers that are 25 to 30 years old. They're dangerous, they're environmentally hazardous, which is why Europe is starting to get nervous. Even though Europe is generally rather slow and indecisive, but everyone understands that if there are any major spills, all the countries surrounding the Baltic in Europe will be in serious trouble. That's why, after all, there is at least some movement. We'll see what comes of it, because Russia has also started deploying warships to escort these tankers, and that's certainly a very interesting situation, because the ships aren't sailing under Russian flags. It's one thing if I'm escorting a ship sailing under the Russian flag, but if it's, say, a Liberian ship and for some reason I'm protecting it, then an interesting question arises. Why exactly are you providing protection? A Liberian ship? What are you so happy about? Why are you escorting it? Therefore, of course, there could be some very unpleasant conflicts here, naval ones. We'll see how it all ends. But the very fact that NATO ships have started to go out and inspect these oil tankers is, of course, an interesting development and overall proper management. So, if the price cap is set at 45, the Greeks will stop transporting. They're afraid of this because, after all, no one wants to end up under sanctions. A vessel that falls under sanctions can practically no longer operate. Even if it carries other cargo, it's still under sanctions as such and is practically lost. But no one wants to lose assets, so if the cap is set at 45 now, the Greeks will again stop transporting Russian oil. And this would be a very big blow to Russian oil exports and consequently to budget revenues.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding American sanctions, a 500% tariff from the US seems like an unrealistic scenario, but what about Blumenthal and Lindsay? Do you think they could lower it, make it 20%, 50%, or 100%? Secondary sanctions would target countries that buy Russian gas, oil, petroleum products, and raw materials, for example, China and India, and they would simply stop doing this. What do you think?
Well, first of all, let's see in what form the bill will be passed, because bills do change. For example, they just passed the big, beautiful bill, and some things were dropped from it as well. There were a few such outrageous provisions that were dropped during the approval process because they were just completely insane, and in the end they were thrown out because, well, European countries made it clear to the US that if this were adopted, the response would be so strong it would be hard to handle. And in this sense, the US would face very strong counter-sanctions, and it would be better if these provisions were not adopted. For example, one of the sections, I think it was 899, it was simply thrown out. So let's see in what form the big, beautiful bill is adopted. And now let's check on Instagram to see how this bill will be passed. I'll put it this way. I paid attention to Graham's words after he played golf. Just think about it. What an idiotic life we've come to. We're discussing politicians' statements after playing golf with the President of the United States. This is a kind of vulgarized political system, but here we are, forced to live in this vulgar political world. It's terrible, it's disgusting. So he said that he and the President had a talk. At least he didn't use the word hash things out. But in general, that's about how their mechanics work. And by the way, Trump's vocabulary is pretty much the same, like street toughs. So we had a talk with the President, and our task is to speed up the adoption of the bill in order to arm the President with this legislation. So if we translate this into concrete terms, it means that this bill started out as a direct action bill, introducing 500% tariffs for countries that purchase Russian energy resources, but most likely it will be adopted as a secondary action law, granting the US President the authority to impose such tariffs. And whether he imposes them or not, well, just look at Trump, how he sometimes imposes things and sometimes doesn't. So I would say that the bill was quite ambitious in its initial scope, Lindsey Graham's bill, but in reality, it could end up being just an empty piece of paper.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding inflation and poverty and the overall risk of social unrest. Thank you. We observe conflicts around us among minorities, and this may even be connected to the construction sector. I spoke with an economist, and he said that the worse the Russian economy performs, the more representatives of ethnic minorities will form their own power blocks, and there will be certain military or paramilitary conflicts. That's how tactfully he put it. Regarding inflation and poverty, is there a risk of a new wave of poverty and social unrest within Russia? I'm interested in your opinion.
The risk of poverty is high. I have an article coming out in the next few days. Maybe it was even published today. I haven't checked yet. In Republic, where I discuss this. Putin declared at the St. Petersburg Forum that Russia is entering an era of high-wage economics. Incredibly beautiful words, absolutely false, absolutely meaningless, but beautifully said. He's truly a master of political demagoguery. In reality, Russia is entering a period of declining living standards because wage growth in Russia has stopped while the cost of living continues to rise. This year, there has been a serious increase. Well, maybe not the very first, but the first truly significant one, and apparently there will be more to come. But the first and most significant one is the increase in utility tariffs. Right now, I'm receiving letters from people all over the country about the increases they've experienced. I think the record was in the Omsk region, 40%. Today, someone sent me another case, somewhere else, a 29% increase in tariffs. This, of course, is a very serious blow, because far from everyone has seen their salaries grow in recent years. Many public sector workers receive such meager compensation for inflation that they've been getting poorer for a long time and no longer understand how they will survive. That's why, of course, Russia is now entering a period of impoverishment. And many who used to be middle class are now becoming poor. They write letters to me too, saying that they used to feel like they were solidly middle class. At the very least, we could afford all the goods necessary for a normal family life. Once a year, we would go abroad on vacation to relax, and everything was great. But now we can't even go into regular stores or supermarkets anymore. And now we go to the cheapest, most bare-bones supermarket, like, for example, Svetofor or Pobeda, where the prices are just pennies. The quality of the products is completely unclear. You don't even know if you'll survive or not. So that's basically the picture. In other words, we've suddenly become poor. We're no longer middle class. We've become poor, and this is a situation that's only going to get worse because most likely there will be even more budget cuts and people will start to suffer because of it. Maybe it will become even more pronounced and severe. This is a trend that has already taken shape. It's about delays in salary payments, a very unpleasant topic for Russians. But that happy story for the country, so to speak, is already over, and now an unhappy one has begun. This has already been stated by Gref. He said that they are receiving quite a lot of requests from individuals who took out loans from Sberbank asking for a deferral on their loan repayments. And in a quarter of the cases, this is simply because salaries are not being paid. We would pay off the loan, but we haven't been paid our salary, so there's nothing to pay with. So you see, this is already happening at the level of Sberbank. Such a trend has taken shape. Non-payments are on the rise. Now utility rates have gone up, and meanwhile, Russians already owe 1 trillion rubles in unpaid utility bills. And now it's quite difficult to pay this off because, generally speaking, those kinds of earnings just don't exist anymore. And as you know, the penalties keep accumulating as well. That's why the penalties are calculated based on the central bank's rate. There are a lot of different approaches to this. So in this sense, people are deep in debt, and electricity will be cut off, gas will be cut off, and Russian cities will start turning into, well, how should I put it, into rather uncivilized places to live. This will lead to people trying to find ways to cope. A year and a half ago, when I said people should start thinking about getting wood stoves for their homes, everyone had a good laugh at my word. A Dutch professor talking like that? What, wood stoves in apartment buildings? How would you even get firewood inside? Up to the top floor, no less. But now, of course, this is becoming very relevant. For now, people have started bringing gas cylinders into their apartment. That's why explosions have started happening in apartments. Well, because people aren't really very good at handling this gas. They've set up gas stoves, you see. They've brought in gas cylinders, and basically they're trying to somehow, apparently the gas has been shut off. They're trying to save money somehow, to survive somehow. But all of this ends up with explosions. Recently, there were as many as 3 explosions in a single day. Household gas exploded, the cylinders blew up. How did a gas cylinder end up in an apartment building? The building is already connected to the gas supply. So where did the cylinder come from? It means they're replacing it? This is the kind of thing that's going to keep happening, and Russian cities will, well, how should I put it, turn into ghettos for the poor. Well, will these events lead to any kind of social discontent? Probably. But it will be very localized. It will be some kind of outrage against the mayor, at most against the governors, but any serious social unrest won't break out, well, unless it gradually escalates. It might get to the point where roads are blocked. Well, that's when other kinds of events will start happening. So keep an eye out for when people in Russia start blocking railways and federal highways. That's when it will become clear that things in Russia are starting to boil over. For now, we don't see that happening.
Igor Vladimirovich, the final topic I wanted to discuss with you today. We see that, among other things, because of Trump's policy, Putin has started using drone and missile terror. Our military command says that in the future it could be 1,000 drones per day, and this will happen regularly, several times a week, maybe even more. In general, Putin is ramping up production, and here I'd like to look at it from both an economic and military perspective. Let me ask you, how much longer can the military machine keep carrying out this terror against Ukraine and scale it up?
Well, scaling it up probably isn't very likely, but continuing it is possible because, of course, notice what Putin said, that Russia is already overburdened with military expenses and that military spending needs to be reduced. He made this statement in Minsk, but I don't think they will cut all military spending to the maximum. They'll cut some spending on the production of those types of weapons that aren't very effective. For example, it's unlikely they'll produce new Russian tanks, as you can imagine. This is a weapon that hasn't performed very well. Russian tanks, no one has seen any Armata tanks on the battlefield, as you can see, even though there were claims that this was a terrifying tank, that it would guarantee victory for the Russian army, and that everything would be accomplished instantly. None of that happened. But they are producing drones, they are ramping up production of this kind of simple equipment, they are sourcing some electronics through China, and this will continue. As long as Russia does not collapse, it will continue to produce a massive amount of weapons, and you will have to fight against that. In this sense, even very poor territories are capable of producing weapons. Look at Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians have destroyed their own economy, their population. They live in poverty, but they still manage to produce all sorts of nasty, vile military means and periodically try to launch them. What does Israel do? It creates the Iron Dome. It develops lasers to shoot things down. I think Ukraine has only one option: to keep developing increasingly powerful air defense systems and to destroy as many launched weapons as possible. I wouldn't count on Russia suddenly weakening and stopping production anytime soon.
Dear audience, please like this video, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments, and subscribe to Igor Lindsay's YouTube channel. This is very important. The link will be in the description. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Dasha Shchaslyva. We work for an audience around the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Crimea. Today we discussed the war economy and the capabilities of the Russian war machine to wage war. Next, with the well-known economist and professor. See you next time. Thank you.
All the best. Goodbye.